There are many habits that an investment banker will change, but the one habit that he cannot change is PowerPoints. So I'm afraid you're stuck with my PowerPoints. But let me, before I begin the presentation formally, just comment very briefly on the film, the beautiful film that we saw from National Geographic, and suggest that why is it that when we see so much beauty and when we see the logic of that beauty and understand that we as human beings define ourselves with respect to nature, value nature in a very deep and fundamental way, even before touching economics, why is it that this window to the world makes no difference, and that after 6:30 when we go home or go to the party, we had forgotten everything that we saw? And yet this is what happens, that no matter how these realizations come through us and no matter how much emotion they arouse in us, we then go back to our normal life. Policy does not change. Markets do not change, human behavior does not change, and then we are back to square one of a continuing situation of depletion of natural resources, of destruction of biodiversity and degradation of ecosystems. If I may pursue that analogy for a moment and say that films like this are windows to the world of nature, what we are really looking for is for a door, so that nature can walk through the door into this economic household that we have created for ourselves, which has become a kind of fortress, and in fact, beyond a fortress has sometimes become a kind of prison, beyond which we are incapable of thinking. So we need the windows to remind us what is there, but I think we also need a door to enable what is there to come in. And I think this fundamentally is if I may draw on your film as a spark of thought, that is what the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity is all about. Providing the door for nature to walk into the real economy, recognizing its value. So today my talk is about this project called TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. A bit of background, and then we will go on to describe how this works and the role that Germany, which has already been one of the originators of this project, and the European Union can play going forward. TEEB's genesis, as some of you may know already, was in this process called the Potsdam Initiative, which began in 2007 and began by asking for a comparison or an analysis to be done of the economic costs and the human welfare costs of the loss of ecosystems and biodiversity. And this thinking was inspired by the Stern Review, which just recently in 2006 had produced an economic argument for early action against climate change, and in fact had proved quite successful. So the thinking was inspired by the Stern Review, and it was to ask the same question. Why can't an economic understanding of nature's losses help to conserve nature? Two reports were brought out, which from this group called TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, described the size of the problem and describe the dimensions, the human dimensions of the problem. So our first report, which was presented in Germany, in Bonn, in the 9th Conference of Parties of CBD, basically said that the extent of losses, if we continued business as usual, and if we measured the natural capital value of these losses that are losses of human welfare, whether it is in the form of nutrients and freshwater flows from the forest to the fields, or whether it's in the loss of fisheries, or whether it's in the loss of ecosystem services, flood prevention, drought control, and so on, or whether it's in the loss of pollinators or bees or any other of the many benefits that come to humanity free from nature, these losses can be calculated in economic terms, and the cost is huge. And we talked about the natural capital value of these losses being of the order of $2 to $5 trillion. That's $2 to $5 million every year in terms of capital. And we said this in the year 2008, which is when the financial markets had just created a financial capital loss of about $2.5 trillion. So we were talking about numbers bigger every year compared to the worst financial crisis that had ever happened in the history of mankind. And I think that got the attention of some policymakers. Not many, but some people at least started asking, but why is this? Explain further. Tell us how you came to these numbers. What can we do? So very soon, the question moved away from puzzlement to understanding that yes, the problem is big in economic terms, and that yes, it does cost well-being and therefore the economy, to asking questions of what do we do? And that's where our next suite of reports, including one that was launched in the European Union last year, came from, which is a report on what can policymakers do to stem the losses of biodiversity and the degradation of ecosystems, and why should they do it, and what are the economic implications of that action. And finally, we have a full suite of reports which addresses all the major constituencies, all of the major groups of decision makers. And we break up these decision makers into broadly 5 categories. Of course, the one which is at the base of this all is the scientists, the economists, those who would be determining what are the right numbers, what are the right calculations and methods. In terms of policy, and economics has become the currency of policy, and that is whether you like it or not, or whether I like it or not. Economics is the currency of policy, so therefore immediately that science and economics becomes input into policy. And policymakers have to be addressed at the national to international level. But also you can not merely end with that, because national and international policy frameworks sometimes do not translate into action on the ground. And for that, you need to address local and regional policy and administrators who are making those policy changes happen materially on the ground. So we have to write separately for those. And then, of course, you have to recognize that 2/3 of the economy is basically private sector, something like more than 2/3 of employment, and sometimes even 80–90% of the taxes that governments receive are from corporations. So you can't try and address this huge global issue and problem by ignoring business. And therefore, we have to write separately for businesses as well, so that CEOs and CFOs can understand what this is about. And finally, not the least, but probably the most important, for people, for you and me, for people on the street, what behavior change do they need? What new understanding do they need of what is going wrong? How are they involved in this? To what extent are these losses of wealth actually losses of their wealth? That's very important, because people normally do not worry too much about others, but they do worry about themselves. Why is this important to the man or the woman on the street? So we launched this project 2.5 years ago, and we were fortunate to assemble together very quickly a very remarkable advisory board. And many of you will recognize some of the names and faces out here. Karl-Jörn Mahler, who's probably someone who has inspired me a lot and has written on this subject for 40 years, 40 years, right? So this is not new, this is old, but the point is it takes this long for humanity to wake up. Lord Stern, of course, after whom this project was, if you like, initially called SIBIOS, the Stern-inspired biodiversity study. But when I went to him to request him to be my advisory board member and said, this is what we are calling it, he did this. So I understood from that he did not like the name very much, so we changed it to TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. And of course, we have continuity from the Millennium Ecosystems Assessment, because Walter Reed, who was the driver and manager of that process, is our board member as well. And we have distinguished institutional heads such as Achim Steiner, my boss at UNEP, Julia Martin-Lefebvre, who is the head of IUCN, Yolanda Kakabadze, who nowadays is the head of the WWF, and Jackie McGlade, who is the head of the EEA, and people like Jochen Flassbart and Ladislav Miko, who were administrators and legislators who actually conceived this project in the first place and felt it was necessary. So they're all there, and to them, my team and I convey our heartfelt thanks, because they have been there every day of the week, and every time we have a request or a puzzle or a need to introduce ourselves to people or to get to an audience, we have had unstinting support from them, their institutions, and from their knowledge. And I think for this, both I and my team are very grateful. One of our advisory board members is Edward Barbier. Professor Ed Barbier is, among other things, a distinguished academician, but also the man who wrote a book that inspired me called Blueprint for a Green Economy. And it was to that book that I went when my daughter Mahima had finally made me think about what's this about? How come some things have value and no price, other things have price and no value? Is this nonsense? Do I have to believe and be part of this stupidity, or can we change something? So it was to Ed Barbier's and David Pearce's book, Blueprint for a Green Economy, that I first went, and then from there, further interest developed. So here again, my first example is Ed Barbier's, which is to do with private profits and public losses. He illustrates this by use of an example from South Thailand, which is to do with shrimp farms and mangrove forests. The coasts of South Thailand are, under normal circumstances, fairly well forested with mangroves. But of course, these mangroves are frequently converted into shrimp farms because it makes economic sense, because you can see the pink box there, which shows that every hectare potentially can generate $9,000+ of value in terms of the profits of the company that converts the mangrove into shrimp farms. And whereas if you leave the mangrove forest as it is, it will only generate about $600 per hectare of value over 9 years, same period, through the timber that local communities will harvest. But if you look more closely, you'll find that actually most of those so-called profits are subsidies. So these are government subsidies given by the local governments to the shrimp farmers to set up the shrimp farms. So that shouldn't be counted. And furthermore, if you go even deeper into the problem and look at the public losses and the public gains, you will find the answers are completely different. Because a mangrove, once it has been converted into a shrimp farm, does not last very long. In fact, 5 to 6 years later, salination and salt deposition will more or less destroy that mangrove. And this is the challenge. How do we make people understand that the losses of public wealth are real losses? Indeed, how do we make them understand that the benefits which the mangroves are providing are public benefits which governments and people should value and conserve? Because if you do not destroy the mangroves, they provide, and that has been statistically measured, benefits in terms of protection against storms and cyclones to the coastal communities and their property, which are worth $10,000 to $12,000 per hectare of that particular coastal mangrove. So there on the right-hand side, we have the real trade-off, which is massively positive in the case of the option of keeping the mangroves and massively negative in the case of destroying them. But in reality, what tends to happen is we only look at choices from a lens of private profits. We do not sufficiently include public wealth, public losses. And this distinction between private wealth on the one hand and public wealth on the other is purely psychological. It's a question of policymakers and communities deciding what's the right way forward. And typically, we have given away some of that decision-making power into this so-called new god of markets, which must dictate everything. And therefore, we tend to miss these public wealth issues because public wealth does not trade in markets. Only private wealth trades in markets. Markets are not here to trade family friendships and community issues. They are here to trade private goods and services, private claims. And this, in summary, is why I believe TEEB is important, because we are firstly making a point that the losses are significant. We are also, and I will come back to this later, making a point that these losses are even most significant for the poorest communities, because the lost ecosystem services may be small in terms of the total value that we receive from our daily lives here in the developed world. But for the poor, it is actually very significant, between 40 and 90%. And as I mentioned, phase 1 had sized the problem, but I think phase 2, which is where we are, is really about exploring the solutions. In exploring the solutions, and this is being brought out by our report for local and regional policymakers, and also will be repeated by the synthesis report that is soon going to be ready and launched at Nagoya, we have many, many examples of solutions. These are examples from all over the world. And I think we need to recognize the patterns in these examples and draw lessons from these examples and try and then understand what solutions exist to resolve this issue of the invisibility, the economic invisibility of nature and ecosystem services, and of the costs of those losses. We don't calculate the value of nature and its benefits to humanity, and when we lose it, we don't calculate the costs of those losses. This invisibility is causing several problems. We need to address them. There are ways of addressing them, and that's really what TEEB Phase 2 is all about. So how do we do this? Well, of course, as you'd expect, we are about putting values, in other words, valuation. So there are 3 layers in which we do valuation. There's a broader societal layer, which is just about recognizing value. It does not need to have any monetary implications explored. For example, if a tribal community somewhere considers a forest to be a sacred forest, there's no economics involved. It just values that forest because it's part of its lifeblood and its society. Or if, for the sake of argument, a national park is declared or was declared 100 years ago, there certainly wasn't economic thinking behind that declaration. It was just a question of human heritage. It was a question of preserving a heritage for the country that had decided to make a certain beautiful area into a national park. So we have valuation of that kind, which is not economic in any sense. Then we have economic value demonstration in terms of finding out what is the value gained in terms of ecosystem services being provided by forests and reservoirs and wetlands to the communities that surround them? Or what could be the value lost? And once again, no money needs to change hands, no payments or receipts need to be made, and you can just come to certain decisions. And finally, we have economic value capture, which means provide means for someone, in other words, the beneficiary, to reward the stakeholders, those who look after these forests or wetlands or natural areas, for the task, for the job of looking after them. And this is what we look at. When we look at these forms of valuation, they work in different spaces. They work in the space of norms and regulations and policies. They work in the space of mechanisms, and they work in the space of markets. And in our TEEB reports, and this is just from one of our reports, which is for regional and local policymakers, we have more than 120 examples that I mentioned. And here is how they break up. So you can see there are many situations where regional plans are made on a sensible basis, just recognizing that there is a value from ecosystem services, that flood prevention and drought control is a benefit which comes out of better managing land and managing forests, which provide that function. Or you can have certification, which is a means of rewarding farmers to look after the quality of the land, the pollution of the land and its topsoil by bad management practice versus good management practice, and providing them with a means of selling their wine or their foods more expensively and to a larger audience as a result of following certain better standards of land management. And then we have payments for ecosystem services, which is basically rewards given by one community to another or by one group of people to another, such as an upland farming community might be rewarded by a lowland city municipality, and this is actually happening in Beijing among other places, for looking after its use of chemical pesticides and fertilizers and not polluting the water, therefore creating better water quality for the users downstream. So these are examples. We have many such examples. Almost half of the 55 examples of payments for ecosystem services are to do with fresh water, which is a huge area of connection between biodiversity, forests, and fresh water. When I look at some of the other areas apart from freshwater, where biodiversity and forests and ecosystems tend to get mainstream, I find that there are actually two broad themes. One is the theme of climate, and the other is the theme of development. So I will have, for the rest of today's session, a few comments to make on each of these themes. Cancun and Nagoya are not by chance close to each other, and certainly not by chance connected. There are many, many, many links between climate on the one hand and biodiversity and ecosystems on the other. And I think two of the most obvious ones come from mitigation and from adaptation. Forestry schemes, RED+, for example, the reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, could be some of the most effective, immediate forms of mitigation that we can achieve as a global community. And the ability of restoration of ecosystems to provide adaptation. In other words, the ability, for example, of the mangroves that I talked about, to provide new forms of food in terms of fish nurseries, and to provide fuel wood, and to provide buffering, in other words, protection from the effects of storms and cyclones as the climate changes. These are forms of adaptation. Adaptation means poor communities being able to adapt to climate change, and the mangrove forest for the poor communities in Vietnam and Thailand is the best form of adaptation they can find. So there is a strong link between adaptation and ecosystem restorations. If you replant or rebuild the mangrove belt, then you're effectively allowing the poor community there to better adapt to climate change. And lastly, I will talk about development links, the links which in fact link all three together: climate on the one hand, biodiversity on the other, and development on the third. Restoring ecosystems is a form of investment. Yeah? It's not about spending money for pretty places and restoring species. It's a form of investment. It is about investing in ecological infrastructure. Just as you build a dam or a reservoir, and just as you build a bridge or a road, so also you can rebuild a forest. And it has a significant impact immediately in terms of climate change. Tropical forests store a fourth of all terrestrial carbons. That's about 540 gigatons out of the total of 2,000 gigatons that are stored. And tropical forests, by the way, are already doing a mitigation function. People are not aware that even before any agreements have been struck, the tropical forests around the world are sequestering, capturing almost 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide every year. which is about 15% of the total emissions of carbon dioxide, which is about 32 gigatons. So there's already a mitigation function being performed by our forests. And guess what? This most powerful mitigation engine on Earth is meanwhile being destroyed because deforestation is a big problem, which therefore releases further carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The only reason that forests net do not contribute to climate is because they are sequestering on the one hand and they're being destroyed on the other. It's like having your biggest machinery for mitigation being chopped up every day, all the time. Not very smart. And finally, the economics of that is compelling. A study was done called the Eliash Review a couple of years ago by the government of the UK, and in that it concluded that the net present value of forest-based mitigation was of the order of 3.7 trillion. And that was basically to halve the rate of deforestation that was taking place at that time. Another recommendation from TEEB is to start better recognizing the value of protected areas, because we tend to think of protected areas purely from a species perspective, and in that process, even though it is true that they are important for conserving species, we sometimes tend not to pay enough attention to the fact that the protected areas are also ecosystems and they're doing a vast job of restoring climate stability through mitigation and carbon capture. And the kind of estimates that are today available for global spending on protected areas tell us how underinvested we are in protected areas. For instance, the global spending in protected areas, or land-based protected areas, by the way, is 6.5 to 10 billion. And a study was done a few years ago which suggested that in order for us to secure these protected areas and to increase them from 10-12% to 15% of land area and to start doing some protection on the oceans, you would need to spend $45 billion. Now, this may sound big, but in fact, those of you who were around and listening last year or 2 years ago would have remembered that the amount that was spent on the financial crisis, in which some bankers were involved as well, I must admit, that amount was about 100 times this amount. So governments had something like $3 trillion of fiscal expenditure arrayed in order to resuscitate their economies, and they spent something like $2.5 trillion just getting the banks and the insurance companies holes in their balance sheets filled up. So $5.5 trillion has already been spent in about a year and a bit, and what we are asking for is 45 billion, which is 1/100th of the amount that you need to sort out an economic crisis. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, the ecological crisis that we are experiencing today is no less significant than the economic and financial crisis that we experienced 2 years ago and are still, by the way, suffering from. And I would just wonder about the logic of anyone who suggests as a senior politician or a leader of humanity that no, we can't possibly spend 1/100th of the amount to stem this ecological crisis compared to what we spent 2 years ago to stem the economic crisis. I can't, for myself, seem to understand the economic logic of doing that thinking. Now, sadly, the amount of funding that is today available, including a large chunk which has been provided by the Red Plus scheme of $4.5 billion, is well short of the amount of funding that is required to make proper investments happen in protected areas and to give them their full capacity to deliver the benefits that they do deliver and which TEEB and others have calculated for you. And some of these benefits coming from investment in ecological infrastructure, I just list these down just so that we remind ourselves that there is afforestation and carbon storage, reduced risk of soil erosion and landslides, reduced risk of flooding, thanks to restoring wetland and forests, reduced coastal erosion and natural hazard defense from mangroves, which I talked about, restoration of forest lakes and wetlands to solve for water scarcity, coral reefs and fish nurseries for fish productivity, and connecting protected areas to make them more capable of being resilient. In other words, being able to last out longer and with less risk when climate changes and when species losses take place. And these are just some of the benefits of investing in ecological infrastructure. We have also got to try and recognize better the links between investment in ecological infrastructure and climate. And just one example, again staying with the mangrove theme for a minute, is from Vietnam. And this gives you the sense of the cost benefit that we are observing. And by the way, again, this is just one example. In our climate issues update, which was a small report we released last year before Copenhagen, we had looked at 19 studies where we had worked out the costs, and we had estimated the benefits. And there were, again, very aggressive ratios of benefits versus costs. But here's one example which came from outside, which is a study done on Vietnam, where we saw that the planting of mangroves as a means of coastal defense cost only slightly over $1 million, but in fact it was saving more than $7 million of annual costs in the alternatives such as building dikes and defending the coastline. And this is not just a story about South Thailand or Vietnam, because right here in Germany, we've had examples shown to us where we can look at climate defense. The peatlands that you have out here in Germany, if you were to drain the 930,000 hectares of peatlands for agriculture, effectively you would have emissions of 20 million tons of carbon dioxide. And the social cost of that is well above 1.4 billion euros. That is an estimate. But we can look at keeping them, restoring them, and in fact benefiting from their continuation. And I think that cost-benefit equation is quite stark when you think in terms of the net cost of carbon dioxide storage, if you like, between almost nothing and 4 euros per tons of carbon dioxide. It's much lower than either the market price of carbon dioxide, which could be 10, 12, 15, 20 euros per ton, or much lower than the Stern Review estimate of the social cost of carbon, which is upwards of 50 euros per ton. So the value of the peatlands is actually as a mitigator of climate change. And it is, once again, like afforestation and forest reduced degradation of forests, it's an economically powerful argument to look at this option versus a dozen other options that may be brought to the table. Natural resource management, once again, in terms of floods and managing of floodwaters and changing climate patterns as evidenced in changing behavior of rivers and floodplains, is not something far away. The damage was estimated at over 2 billion when the Elbe flooded in 2002. And one of the learnings from that is therefore the effective value of ecosystems in regulating floods and of managing upstream ecosystems better in order to be able to provide better and more resilient defenses. The economic damage apparently was collectively across the whole region was 9 billion euros. And I think what we have to look at, and this is something that TEEB has formulated, is a kind of step-by-step approach to understanding the problem, understanding the policy implications. And I'll just talk you through what I would describe as a TEEB approach by applying it in hindsight, I must say, to the Elbe, because in a sense, our approach has been evolved through the learnings from examples such as this. So our first step usually tends to be to specify and agree on the problem. And of course, the problem here is the severe human and economic cost of the flooding, with 9 billion euros collectively. And the step 2, which is to understand which ecosystem services are the most relevant, and those, of course, are the flood prevention benefits of upstream afforestation and forests, the habitats that are provided for species, and the ability to retain and provide nutrients, soil nutrients. And the third step tends to be to define the information that you need to collect in order to make new policy changes. And of course, this kind of information would be including the economic information, cost-benefit analysis, and replacement costs for assessing nutrient losses and so on. And finally, the fourth step is about actually doing the assessment. And in this example, it would mean, thinking about how you can relocate dikes and creating new flood retention, creating and establishing polders, creating additional surfaces where floods can infiltrate and basically prevent losses taking place into built and habited areas. And a combination of these measures could be recommended. And finally, working out the benefit-cost ratios of these actions versus their impacts. So these are sort of the steps that we tend to follow. And the last step, of course, is to actually assess the distributional impacts, which may not be that relevant in a country like Germany, which is largely well-to-do, but is extremely important in the poorer countries, where we have to look at who benefits from these impacts and who pays the costs of these actions. So this is the basic approach towards analyzing ecosystem-based actions, which TEEB has advocated. We're also looking at opportunities for research, and it is a fact that even though there is a vast amount of research brought to the table by the TEEB project and its compilation, the reality is that there are many gaps. There are gaps in understanding the science. There are gaps in getting locational information, because TEEB and ecosystems and biodiversity are not like climate change. We can't simply measure gases and their impacts. Biodiversity is always local, it's always regional, and it's also always global. So you have, by definition, lots of gaps in knowledge, and more research is required. But at the same time, I will say that you don't have to wait for perfect knowledge in order to act. And I think as human beings, we all know that. We don't wait for perfect information before we decide where we invest, which shares we buy or sell, who we marry, which friends we make, etc., etc. We don't wait for perfect knowledge, otherwise nobody would ever do anything. And the same applies for nature as well. Yes. My next theme, away from climate but also connected to climate, is about TEEB and economic development. Right? So, as I mentioned, the interim report had brought to the fore this whole issue of why ecosystems are important for the poor. And we had given an example of Haiti, where the losses of forests from over 95% to under 4% was one of the reasons why there was inability in Haiti. This is way before the earthquake, but Haiti already was a problem and a tragedy because of ecosystem losses, forest losses. So because of that, there was a constant cycle of floods and droughts. There was inability to retain soil. When a reservoir was built, the Avazak Reservoir, it got silted up much faster than expected. Half its productivity was lost. Women's health and women's nutrition was and is a problem. And children in Haiti suffered, almost 90% of them suffered from chronic intestinal problems because of having drunk and continuing to drink the polluted water that came down in a spate of floods during the seasons when it rained. So these were problems already there in Haiti, and all of these problems, in one way or the other, are described as Millennium Development Goals. Child health and child mortality is MDG 4, Millennium Development Goal number 4. Women's health is Millennium Development Goal number 5. The inability to solve hunger is MDG 1. The inability to have development and agriculture is MDG 8. And of course, environment is MDG 7. All of these MDGs 1, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8 were there and still are there in Haiti because of one basic problem: the lack of neglect of ecological infrastructure, the lack of loss of focus on the loss of forests and what it really means to the lives of people. And this is the connection of TEEB away from the pure numbers of TEEB into the human aspects, which is the livelihood dependencies of the poor on ecosystems and biodiversity. In economic terms, I'll illustrate this point with an example from TEEB, which looks at ecosystem services. If you look at the top line of pie charts, you will see ecosystem services, if you like, the missing components of GDP, which are not counted as GDP because no one calculates the value of flood prevention and drought control and nutrients and fresh water as they flow from the forest to the field. These are all economic values, but they are free. They come free from nature, so they don't get counted. And they don't look big because they are between 10 and 20%, as you can see, of the GDP of these three countries, Indonesia, Brazil, and India. But when you ask the question, to whom did these benefits flow? Who suffers when you don't have a forest to absorb fresh water and release it slowly over the year? Who suffers, in other words, whose fields are lost when they are flooded or when there's a drought? Well, it's the poor farmer who suffers. Who suffers when there's no forest to go to for collecting fodder for cattle and goats? The poor farmer. Who suffer if his wife cannot go to the forest to collect fuel wood for cooking? The poor farmer. When you keep asking the question, who suffers because of this loss, the answer comes back, the poor. So what we have is a mistaken notion that you can measure ecosystem services divided by GDP. Basically, the denominator is wrong. You should measure ecosystem services divided by the GDP of the poor. And when you do that calculation, the answer is completely different, because here you then understand that ecosystem services, all of the benefits that I talked about, are actually between half and, in one case, 90% of the value of the household incomes of the poor, whether they are poor agriculturalists in India and Indonesia, or whether they are poor tribals who are gathering rubber and coconuts and nuts from the trees of the forests of Brazil. The reality is they depend almost totally on these forests for their livelihood in one form or the other. And that dependency is at the core of development strategy if it is to succeed. You cannot develop by saying to people, you will have schools for education and better health services, but by the way, to deliver you schools and health services, I have to destroy all your forests and block all your wetlands, and therefore completely take away from you 3/4 or half of your livelihood. That's not called development, that's just foolishness. So we have to have a different idea of what is development. You cannot develop by taking away something from the poor and then giving them something else which doesn't substitute. You have to keep what is there and provide on top of that forms of education and health and integration and access and equitable access, I should say, to, number one, the actual ecology of their lands, and then beyond that to health, education, and so on. And I think this development paradigm has to change. We cannot keep thinking in terms of let's build a massive dam and everything will be okay because the trickle-down effect will work. I'm sorry, it doesn't work. I come from a developing country. I've seen many dams built next to poor villages. The villages remain poor. The corporations who build the dams make profits. It doesn't work. So let's get real about this. And I think recognize the value of ecosystems and biodiversity and recognize the importance from a development paradigm of building that infrastructure as much as we build physical infrastructure to deliver electricity or fresh water to the farms and villages. Now, TEEB has also thankfully been accepted within the CBD policy framework, and there is, you will see at Nagoya coming up, a number of places where we are seeing the value of TEEB's inputs coming through. At the last COP and at the time that the last targets for biodiversity were set, there was an issue because of not enough focus. There was enough focus on pressures and the state of biodiversity, but not enough on the actual underlying causes of the loss of biodiversity, and not enough focus on the value or the benefits from ecosystem services. But of course, this is exactly where TEEB comes from. We're coming exactly to it from that point of view, and that's where I think our value is to the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And I think you can see that just in the number of places that we find the inputs from TEEB have got reflected into the documents in the CBD, whether they are Substa documents or these are just meetings which are held before the CBD. But you can see the number of places that are references to TEEB reports. And I think that's a good thing because it suggests that the value of ecosystems and biodiversity will become very much a toolkit, part of the toolkit of the policymaker as they try and integrate biodiversity into development policy and try and move things forward in a way that is win-win, both improves development chances but also preserves biodiversity. Now I come at the end to a few comments about TEEB itself and what do we do next, because everyone asked me now that the reports are ready and well publicized, what happens now? So I have to answer that question, what happens now? So to answer that question, we have to first understand what we have made, what we have built. And what we have built in TEEB, and this is thanks to the hard work of many people, not least Carsten, my colleague who is sitting there and smiling, and who's working about 20 hours every day for the last several months on the reports that we are more, he says, more than 20 hours a day. And Carsten and his colleagues at UFZ have done a sterling job, a wonderful job, keeping this whole infrastructure alive and delivering us. And so have many other colleagues around the world. They're not all here, so I can't name them, but there are more than 550 people who are researchers, writers, authors, reviewers, advisory board members who have been personally involved and have given their time and energy to this project. And to them all, I'm very, very grateful because I think we have put together these assets, as I call them for TEEB, thanks to their efforts. So what are these assets? The number one is, of course, the reports themselves because they are there for people to use. And they need to be maintained because in 2-3 years' time, more information will come up, new information. So there needs to be a second or a third edition of TEEB at some stage in the future. The second asset is the TEEB approach, which is cautious, which is sensible. We are not believers in monetizing everything. We are not believers that, we are not sort of simplistic economists who think that just by making everything private, you will solve problems. It doesn't work like that. I have been in markets for 25 years. I know perfectly well what markets can do and what markets cannot do. And markets are fantastic at creating price discovery and allocation of capital, and sometimes, if they're allowed, the punishment of misallocation of capital. They're good at doing all of that, but they're not very good at solving social problems. And markets were not made to solve social problems. Policies are made to do that. So we have to look at policies and markets, and the mix of those is what matters. And that is absolutely built into the approach that TEEB has evolved and is there in all parts of TEEB, whether it's a TEEB for policymakers or TEEB for administrators, or indeed in TEEB for business. So I think this approach is also an asset because it forces people to think through logically, think through constructively, and understand what needs to change and where. It needs stewardship. We cannot have a situation where fly-by-night operators and consultants would come around and say, oh, let me do a TEEB project for you, and I'll charge you $2 million, and here's my spreadsheet. And that is not going to work, because it is a much more detailed and complex area. It needs understanding and maturity and recognition of the human dimensions. And I think that approach needs stewardship. So Germany and the other funders who were kind enough to start this project have now got to step up to their responsibility of looking after it. When you have a baby, it's not sufficient for it to be born. You have to look after it, feed it, clothe it, and so on. So now is your time to step up to feed and clothe this baby which you have given birth to, right? So that is about the TEEB approach. The third is the TEEB community. And as I mentioned, we have 550 individuals who are economists, ecologists, biologists, zoologists, administrators, policymakers, people in business, colleagues of mine, bankers, businessmen. They are all committed personally, people in advertising, committed to make this a success. They are a community, and someone has to act as a nodal agent for them, and maybe UNEP will, maybe somebody else will, but somebody has to. And finally, it's also a quality, a brand, if you like. We need to maintain the connection of quality with TEEB, because we are very, very careful. We constantly review everything we do. We are always peer-reviewed. And this quality association is important, and it must be maintained. So these are the assets, and I think in order for us to recognize the value of these assets, we also need to understand how much demand is coming. And this is just my personal summary. These are simply what I'm listing for you people here as what I have been asked to do next year. And I just nod and say, sorry, I'm really busy. We have to finish this project first. I'll talk to you in November. And the number of phone calls I have to make in November, I can't even make a list of them. And every day the list grows longer. But all the demands that are coming to us are basically in these 5 or 6 categories, 5 categories. Developing countries are asking us for help to build capacity, which means help us create economic expertise and analytical expertise and data collection and data analysis in our country so that we can do this kind of work. We can set up valuations of protected areas. We can declare new protected areas. We can work out payments for ecosystem services. We can price good certification policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We want to do it. Help us. And, well, I would love to, and I'm sure our colleagues in the TEEB network would love to, but someone has to pay for this because these developing countries need funding. And there's, I would imagine, at least $15 to $30 million worth of funding pot that's required to start addressing the needs of more than 10 developing countries who have come to us already and asked for expertise and capacity building. Number 2, Brazil and India have already announced Brazil TEEB and India TEEB. They have announced a full-scale project in both cases at the ministerial level to go ahead and do country TEEBs. India was just last week. I was with Minister Jairam Ramesh and lovely guy, Jairam Ramesh, my country's environment minister, and he wanted to find out when I was back in India next, and I said, oh, I'm taking some leave in India in November. He says, very good, just spare me half a day of that leave. So that was it. So my leave is finished as well. So 12th of November, I'm there in a day-long seminar now, launching the TEEB India project. The Brazil minister, Isabella Teixeira, again, a marvelous person. When I must tell you the story about Isabella. When I first met her, this was in Sao Paulo, and we were at a conference, and we had just, that is, United Nations Environment Program had just announced Isabel Bunchen as our UNEP Goodwill Ambassador. So she turned to me, I was sitting like where you are in the audience, she turned to me and said, now you go back to your boss, Achim Steiner, and tell him that I may not be, Isabella, I'm not as tall or as beautiful or as blonde, or as thin as Isabel Bunchen, or as rich, but I'm much better for biodiversity. So that's Isabella Teixeira, who has launched the Brazil TEEB project already 4 or 5 months back in Brazil. And I hope Germany will as well have a German TEEB project to sort of provide one consolidated information base of analysis which can be used by policymakers, and the European Commission has already, and I've just learned that the ADB is sponsoring an Asian TEEB study. So this is beginning, but what will be required is people, as in experts within the TEEB network, to be financed, to be helping these various country projects. A third area where people are asking is that the World Bank and the ADB and others and UNEP have decided to go ahead and implement the recommendation of TEEB and other people that we should have ecosystem accounting. And a first mover group of 10 to 12 nations is forming, 5 or 6 developing nations, 5 or 6 developed nations. And it is my hope that Germany would be one of the developed nations. I don't know, I have not had a chance to discuss with Minister Röttgen or with others here, but I hope that there will be an interest from Germany to participate in that project. And I think the most interesting one is the fourth one, which is coming from businesses saying that just as we have done a few analyses of business impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity, why don't you do for steel and for cement and for tourism and for this and for that and for that? And instead of just 2 studies which you have in your report, you should have at least 500 studies which covers all major businesses with their major impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity so that they can understand what it means to have a net positive impact or a net zero impact. And this is huge because what this means is we will have to set up a kind of TEEB foundation which is funded by institutional money and by corporates. And I don't know how much it costs, but I mean, typically we are talking about every project for a ecosystem impact by a particular sector taking at least 6 months to a year. And you have to do many of these simultaneously. And I believe there are at least 400 or 500 clear-cut cases which we have to explore. So this is a massive project. We need a foundation to set this up. I'm hopeful that Germany will step up again as one of the creators of TEEB with some institutional money to feed this foundation and to start the work going. And then as the work starts, I do expect many other corporations, and a few corporate CEOs have said, if there is a group, then we will join. So I think there is clearly a need to move forward here. And last and not the least, and I think this has already received some funding from the European Commission, is the outreach. How do you explain these complicated ideas to people in a simple way so that when business changes its product plans or its packaging or its distribution policy or its marketing in response to TEEB's signals, then these are understood by buyers, by consumers? Or how do we get people to change their attitudes when politicians make policies which conserve biodiversity, that politicians should not get shouted at for being silly, but in fact rewarded with votes for doing the right thing for the future? So these are the sort of demands that we're getting. And I believe that in following these demands, we can actually make a win-win solution, a win-win set of solutions happen. I close with an interesting example here. Some of you may know this already. This is Ecuador, a challenge if ever there was any. Now, what Ecuador has brought to the table is fascinating. They are saying, and this is a small country in Latin America, for those who are not familiar, they are saying that their Yasuni National Park, which is about 4,000 square miles of pristine wilderness, sits right on top of a large oil field called the ITT. The ITT oil field of Ecuador has almost $1 billion barrels of oil there, and basically it is 20% of their oil reserves. And what they are saying is that we will leave this 20% of our national oil wealth untouched and unexplored in order to conserve that biodiversity hotspot, so long as the international community pays for half of the cost. And right now, as I speak, the Minister of Ecuador is actually on an international tour. She's trying to raise $100 million as the international contribution to that. The economics of this actually is interesting because we have to look at holistic costs. The argument that TEEB is proposing here is very simple, which is that you should drill for oil, but do it where it is cheapest first. So right now it is cheapest to drill for oil in the Middle East, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, etc., because there are hardly any externalities other than carbon dioxide emissions. If you drill for oil out here, there are significant externalities. There are 2 million tribals who will be affected who live in and around the 12 national parks. There is a massive biodiversity hotspot, which is outstanding, which will be disturbed. And at the end of the day, what Ecuador has offered is we will provide livelihoods for those sustainable livelihoods for the tribals who depend on their protected area network. Hello. And we will also invest in making Ecuador's economy totally carbon-free. So they're actually planning to make use of the money to make a carbon-free economy. And I think that sounds like a good deal to an interested international community. This is not about saying, is this the best one, or will it happen again, or will every country in Latin America ask us to do the same thing? I think that's begging the question, because the point is, here's an offer which is on the table from a developing country saying, we will bear half the opportunity cost, you please bear the other half, let's sit down, work it out, set up a trust fund, and the trust fund is being set up, by the way, right now, as I speak, by the United Nations Development Program. So this is happening. The question is, and of course, when I go to Nagoya, I will talk about this and also about the Satoyama initiatives, which I admire and like very much. And I'm hoping that the people and the nations and the institutions that come to Nagoya will show conviction and show commitment and come out and support these ideas. And I think very interesting and positive results for humanity might ensue. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's really all I had to tell you today except to say that I'm looking forward to Nagoya. I'm looking forward to Nagoya mainly because it is not just another convention on biological diversity. I think it is the convention on biological diversity. I think this one meeting is signal because this is when humanity has to take a vote. It has to take a vote for its own survival. It has to take a vote for its future generations. It has to take a vote for the living fabric of this planet, its ecosystems and biodiversity. And I do hope they vote for the right outcome. Thank you.